Thanks, Shahad, and thank you to the Organization for Human Rights for sponsoring this very important discussion. I thought I would, in a sense, pick up where Bill left off and elaborate a bit, because many of you are describing, I think, very eloquently, the day-to-day repression that the Israeli government is imposing on the Palestinian people. And I would like to take a step back and elaborate a bit on why it is that Human Rights Watch, in our report of 3 years ago, found that this repression adds up to the crime against humanity of apartheid. And we did that not to make a historical analogy to South Africa. That was sort of one of the things the Israeli government said, oh, we're not South Africa. But instead, we applied international law, in particular, two treaties, the UN Convention Against Apartheid and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And they define apartheid, they define the crime. Slight variations, but in essence, it comes down to three elements. An intent to dominate by one racial group over another, systematic oppression, and then inhumane acts, certain manifestations of that oppression. And we found that the intent to dominate existed from the river to the sea. We found that while there was systematic discrimination within 1967 Israel Green Line, that there was systematic oppression within the occupied territories, that is to say, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And there were numerous examples of inhumane acts in those territories. And so where those three elements come together, we found that the Israeli government is committing not only the crime against humanity of persecution, but also the crime against humanity of apartheid. Now, what was the defense to that offered by the Israeli government and its partisans? And various ones. I mean, one was to say, what are you talking about? Apartheid is about race. There are not racial differences between Israelis and Palestinians. But in fact, if you look at the law, if you look at the Racial Discrimination Convention, race is understood to include ethnicity, and it completely applies to the Israel-Palestine situation. Many people said, oh, but the Israeli government faces a very difficult security situation. There's terrorism. And it does. But we started looking at, well, so what are the actual practices that we define, that we described that add up to that oppression? And many of these have nothing to do with security. They have to do with demographic engineering. And so, why is it that a Palestinian family living in Area C of the West Bank, if they want to add a bedroom because their family is growing, the Israeli government refuses to give them permission, and if they go forward anyhow, it gets demolished? Why is it that there are all kinds of restrictions on, who gets to live in the West Bank, who gets to live in East Jerusalem, whether an Israeli citizen married to a Palestinian gets to live within Israel? All demographic engineering, nothing to do with security. And perhaps the most visible thing is, why is there proliferation of these settlements and these outposts? Those actually make Israel less secure because, Israelis have to be defended in all these outlying areas in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. That's about, a territorial grab. It's not about security. So when you start looking, much more closely at these oppressive practices, you realize that, this is about domination. This is about, ensuring a Jewish majority in various areas. This is apartheid. There's no defense to it. Now, one frequent defense, and in fact, I think this is part of why it took Human Rights Watch so long to arrive at this conclusion, is people say, well, yes, things are bad. Yes, there's all this oppression, but there's the peace process. The peace process will solve all of this. And, that maybe had a bit of credibility in the first decade after Oslo, maybe a little less, but still some credibility in the second decade after Oslo. We've now just finished the third decade, moving into the fourth. There is no peace process. That's gone. It is completely moribund. This vision of a two-state solution that informed Oslo, that's over with. If you look on the ground, there is a one-state reality. That all of these settlements and outposts, bypass roads and restrictive laws and all of this have basically, turned the West Bank into Swiss cheese, these tiny little isolated Palestinian enclaves Bantustans, but something that would never become a reasonable, contiguous Palestinian state. And so interesting, who still talks about the two-state solution? Who still talks about the peace process? Basically, as far as I can see, it's two kinds of people. One is Western government officials who are doing everything they can to avoid having to come to terms with the reality on the ground. And the second, is the Palestinian Authority, because they, like being the head of a state. They don't want to give up this vision. If they don't have that, the gravy train stops, the prestige stops. Of course, they haven't held an election in years and years and years. But that's pretty much it. And most people these days recognize that there is this, unfortunate one-state reality. And then once you accept that, then you either accept the status, the status quo is apartheid. And the only solution to that really is equal rights within that single state. So that's sort of, where we are. The one final thing I wanted to mention is, and Bill alluded to this, if you say what I just said, you are very often accused of being anti-Semitic. And the kind of basis for that these days is a definition of anti-Semitism that was promulgated by something known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA. And it basically is designed to stifle criticism of Israel with accusations of anti-Semitism. And so if you demonize Israel, one of its terms, you're anti-Semitic. It really means if you criticize Israel. If you, say that it is racist, you're anti-Semitic. And of course, saying that it's, a perpetrator of apartheid is saying that it's acting in a racist way. So then you're anti-Semitic. If you apply a so-called double standard, which, so many Israeli partisans spend all of their time saying, oh, you treated, so-and-so this way and Israel that way, or, why did you put out this report on Israel and not on Palestine? You're anti-Semitic. Now, there are alternative definitions of anti-Semitism, the Jerusalem Declaration, the Nexus document, which make clear that these kind of legitimate fact-based criticisms of Israeli government practice are not anti-Semitism, they're legitimate discourse. And it's bad enough that this is just a censorship effort, but the people who use anti-Semitism charges in this way actually are harming the Jews because they are cheapening the concept of anti-Semitism. And if people see this very serious issue of anti-Semitism as just, another way to avoid criticism of Israel, people stop taking anti-Semitism seriously. But, that seems to sort of be the intent. I mean, if you look at Netanyahu, he could kind of care less about Jews around the world. They haven't done Aliyah to Israel, so therefore, who cares about them? He just wants to protect his government. And so he cozies up to people like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a blatant anti-Semite, because Orban embraces Netanyahu. So I think we have to, turn the tables here and say, this finding of apartheid, the finding of persecution, the description of the repression that many of you are eloquently reciting, this is all legitimate factual criticism. And those who try to silence us with charges of anti-Semitism are doing harm to the effort to stop anti-Semitism.